Welcome to Massey College and to the launch of this 2020 Massey Lectures. My name is Nathalie de Rosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. In the drudgery of our COVID depression, there are a couple of high points this fall, and one of them is tonight. We're so delighted to launch the Massey Lectures 2020 by Ron Deibert, entitled Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. I'm very pleased to welcome you at Massey College. It's a place that was built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and our gratitude for the ability to continue our work here. The Massey Lecture has a long pedigree that has shaped Canadian discussions for decades. It continues to be a primary pulpit to frame the discussion that we must have. The Massey Lectures are obviously essential to the Massey College, whose mission is to nourish learning and serve the public good. It really is a model, the Massey Lecture, in the way it has brought to the public big ideas that were relevant to their times. It's such a fundamental aspect of our democratic project that we commit ourselves to being better citizens by understanding well what's going on around us. And this is particularly the case for what this Massey Lecture will be all about. So I just want to say how delighted we are about this great book and the great series that on CBC Ideas that will feature Ron Deibert. This book, I think, is quite an interesting one that kind of aims to bring clarity, theory to our constant struggle between security and liberty, between privacy and convenience, between the market and accountability, from our surveillance capitalism, the invasive, ever-present technological ecosystem that connects, disconnects us, engages us. We are struggling. We always are struggling. In a way, humanity has always been in a love-hate relationship with technology, but these days it feels almost like it's no longer love-hate, but more that we are being harassed, stalked, and forced to consent. And this is really what Ron Deibert has written for a long time. That's what he talks about, and more importantly, what his Citizen Lab has challenged. I want to acknowledge the great work that is done, he and his team at the Citizen Lab. I have personally read, listened, and invited Ron Deibert for many years to many forums. So it's a real honor for me to be here tonight to celebrate his giving the Massey Lecture. My role here is to whet your appetite for the book and tell you where to buy it. You can buy it at the bookstore, and it will be featured on the YouTube chat where exactly you can get it. We're obviously using social media to discuss this book, but it's kind of one of the challenges and the weird aspect of the ironies of our time. I also want to say the Massey Lecture only exists because it is a partnership. It is a partnership between the publisher, Anansi Press, and CBC Ideas. So let me first introduce the new publisher of Anansi Press, Bruce Walsh, who was the founding director of University of Regina Press, a vice president of Margaret Atwood's Long Pen, the director of marketing and publicity at McClellan Stewart, a two-time winner of the Libris Award for his outstanding contribution to Canadian publishing. He has been a mentor to the Pierre Trudeau Foundation, a board member at the Dunlop Art Gallery, PEN Canada, and Canopy. He is the recipient of the Order of the Forest and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for his work for environment, free speech, and the advancement of culture. I'm so delighted to welcome him for his first Massey Lectures as well. Canopy. He is the recipient of the Order of the Forest and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for his work for environment, free speech, and the advancement of culture. I'm so delighted to welcome him for his first Massey Lectures as well.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It's very nice to be here. I'm coming to you tonight from the edge of Hurricane Teddy in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and would like to thank the Massey College for hosting this virtual book launch, and Emily Mockler and Abra Rissi for their work to make it happen. As the newly minted publisher of House of Anansi Press, I can take no credit for Ron Deibert's book, Reset, but I can thank him for it. Reset is as prescient as any Massey lecture, and like the best, it is greater than the sum of its parts. The Massey format may have changed because of COVID, but Reset remains a cultural intervention. Reset gives us a new way of thinking about urgent issues. It offers solutions. It fires us up to take action. I'd like to thank my colleagues at House of Anansi Press for their passion and industry publishing Reset. Janie Yoon, Maria Golikova, Alicia Shushak, Laura Brady, Debbie DeGroot, Sonia Lally, Karen Brochu, and Laura Chapnick. All deserve our praise, as does recently retired Sarah McLaughlin, who published 17 Massey lectures, and along with Scott Griffin, built House of Anansi Press into the publisher it is today. I've been listening to ideas on CBC radio since Lister Sinclair. Under host Nahlah Ayed, it has only gotten better. The show opens minds, fills them with knowledge, and allows us to see the world in a new way. It thrills me to have the opportunity to work with executive producer Greg Kelly and producer Philip Coulter on the lectures. Thank you so much for your work. Nourish learning and serve the public good, says the Massey College mission statement. That's what the CBC does. That's what House of Anansi Press does too. Working together, we amplify one another and make cultural interventions achievable. I would like to thank Nathalie de Rosiers, principal of Massey College, for making the Massey lectures possible. In 2008, I worked for Margaret Atwood when she delivered her Massey lecture, Payback, during one of her numerous interventions into the culture. Her topic was debt. As the global economy crashed around us because of debt, her analysis became essential to understanding what had happened to us and why. Another Massey lecture, The Wayfarers by Wade Davis, helped shape my life. Half of the 7,000 languages spoken today, with all the brilliance they contain, will be gone in our lifetime. John Ralston Saul called this the worst form of censorship. So I moved to Saskatchewan, started University of Regina Press, and published books in Cree, Woods Cree, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Lillooet, Gros Ventre, along with Clearing the Plains, The Education of Augie Morasti, and Firewater. Wade Davis, Massey College, the CBC, and the House of Anansi Press fired me up. That's what the Massey lectures do. Tonight, we launch another intervention into the culture by the founder of the world-renowned Citizens Lab. As Edward Snowden has said, no one has done more than Ron Deibert and his lab to expose the enemies of the internet. No one is better placed to explain the intersection of law and technology that makes these abuses possible. Reset is the definitive narrative of where we went wrong and the last chance to make things right. On behalf of House of Anansi Press, I congratulate Ron Deibert on the launch of Reset and his Massey lectures.
Thank you so much, Bruce. What a wonderful introduction. Reading the Massey lecture is one of the special pleasure of the fall, but listening to it on CBC Ideas is another one. So I'm really happy to welcome as well Greg Kelly, who's the executive producer of Ideas. He began his career at CBC, where he won national, international awards for documentaries, work that he did for radio and TV. And then he left Canada to create and lead radio program in the US, in Europe, and then happily return. We're so grateful that he returned to CBC Ideas in 2013. He has a doctorate in English literature from Oxford University, and he's been really the man behind thinking about the future of ideas. Welcome, Greg.
Well, thank you, Nathalie, and thank you, Bruce, for these kind and welcoming words. And listening to Bruce speak about what Anansi and what Massey College, what education, what ideas and CBC does. One of my colleagues once said that at our best, and I would include not just ideas, but our colleagues here and many of the endeavors of people we know, that at our best, we help explain water to fish. And so the water that we're swimming in now is, of course, social media. It is all over, like it or not. And that water is sometimes, well, I'm reluctant to put my foot in it from time to time. Well, most days, actually. But one of the pleasures that helps counteract that displeasure is when I get to approach somebody like Ron to see if they would do the Massey lectures. So when I approached Ron in a phone call, it didn't take very long to set up, and spoke to him and said that, the committee met and it's unanimous, we'd like to offer you the 2020 CBC Massey lectures. And there was a slight pause, and Ron said, it's quite an honor. I think I'd like to, I just need to think about it a bit. Can I get back to you? And then he did get back to me, and he said yes. And then chapters started to flow. Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and this book came out. I'll just pause button it right there, because sometimes in the nearly 60 years of the Massey lecture production, it can be pulling teeth. It can be, and on certain occasions you actually have to give the prospective speaker the teeth in order to pull them. That was not the case with Ron. It was just a wonderfully smooth delight in the entire process. And I can't think of anybody better positioned, particularly in this pivotal year, 2020, with an election in the United States and the ongoing backdrop and foreground that is social media. It's not just that Reset confirms my own reflexive bigotry against social media. And as somebody much wiser than I once said, the problem with social media is that it's neither. And so Ron, of course, picks apart the antisocial aspects of social media, its ubiquity, not just its capacity to surveil us and then sell us stuff that we don't really need, but the linkages in a complex chain reaction of what you can only call authoritarianism right now. When you look at the rise of authoritarian leadership across the world, the role that social media play, well, you just have to encounter Ron's lectures in book form or audio form to get those dots connected. But I must say that another sort of bête noire of mine, various dark figures of Silicon Valley, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, whom I'm one of those who enjoy hating him. And for all of his billions, I still can't answer the question for myself, what's with the Prince Valiant haircut? It goes beyond ad hoc. It goes into the structure of how Silicon Valley has permeated almost every aspect of modern living. So the zoom out, the trenchant global analyses of how all of this works, how what happens in a hacking room in Ukraine may affect what's going on in the United States, in turn in Myanmar, and what's going on with Rohingya, all the way to zoom in. Ron and his staff, excuse me, at Citizens Lab have lived this story, this set of stories out personally, where the technological gets personal, sometimes to the point almost of farcical encounters. And again, you'll have to encounter Ron's Massey lectures to experience those for yourselves. So it's an incredible tour de force. It has opened my eyes when I have felt like shutting them. And there are surprises. It's not just a walk into the Silicon Valley of death. It isn't. It goes beyond that to what might be, and should be very, well thought out and debatable, and items to be debated and chewed over for solutions to the mess that we are now in. And one of the terms that he rescues, much to my surprise, is small r republicanism. Not to give away too much, but I just did not expect that term to be uttered in this context. And having got on the other end of it, I must say it's a very powerful argument, and again opens your eyes so that the comfort that hand-wringing can sometimes provide the thinking classes is skated around quite deftly. I told Ron in my last conversation with him that was held virtually that never before have I felt such gratitude for experiencing such despair, because it is a dark portrait of the reality. But he points the way forward. There are these big apertures of light that it's up to us and a bunch of other people in power and who are not yet in power to see about remedying. So Ron, if we were there in person, all of us together, we would have some port or champagne or something. So I will simply toast you and all the people involved in the Massey machinery for this year's 2020 CBC Massey Lectures. You're extraordinary.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Greg. And well, let's get to the interview for tonight, where we get to meet the author, Ron Deibert, interviewed by no one other than Nahlah. Nahlah is the award-winning veteran foreign reporter. She's been everywhere around the world. She's been in the Middle East. She covered all the major stories of our time, you know, from Europe's refugee crisis, the Brexit vote, its fallout. She's a graduate of Carleton, and also she has a master in interdisciplinary studies, philosophy, and a bachelor of science in genetics. And she was born and raised more or less in Winnipeg. And she has been the voice of reason that we love to hear. So we're so delighted that she's here. She also holds many honorary doctorate from many universities, and we are really honored by her presence with us tonight. She will be interviewing, certainly, the author, Ron Deibert. Ron Deibert is a senior fellow at Massey College, but he's also a professor of political science and the director, as we know, of the Citizens Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. The Citizens Lab has been a force to be reckoned with. It has issued more than 2,000 reports and received exclusive front page coverage from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other global media around for the last decade. He is the author of Black Code, Surveillance, Privacy, and the Dark Side of the Internet, and millions, numerous book chapters, articles, reports, and it's been a wonderful place to be reading you for so long, Ron. And I just want to say I'm so happy that you are giving the 2020 Massey Lecture. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, for the lovely introduction to both of us. Huge congratulations to you, Ron, of course. We have a lot to talk about, but I know that you'd like to say a few words first, so please go ahead.
Oh, well, first I have to say thank you so much, Bruce, Nathalie, and Greg, for those comments. Wow, I don't know what to say. I feel like just shutting it down right now and walking away after that introduction. I also want to thank House of Anansi Press. It was such a pleasure to work with the people there, Janie, Maria, and everybody else. I won't go down the list. Bruce preempted me on that, but they were so supportive and professional along the way, and it was just such a delight to work with them and a real joy. I want to thank the team at CBC, Greg, of course, and Philip and you, Nahlah. It's surreal to be asked to do the Massey Lectures and to think about it being broadcast on Ideas like Bruce. I've listened to this all my life, and it's just unbelievable to be given this privilege. I also want to thank the Citizen Lab and all my incredible and talented staff that each day I work with, that inspire me, that are so professional and engaged. It's the greatest job in the world, and it's purely because I'm surrounded by such dedicated, talented people on a daily basis. And then lastly, of course, I want to thank my family, my wife Jane, and my children Emily, Roz, Ethan, and Michael. I love you all, and thank you for supporting me in this project and this endeavor. I look forward to all of you reading the book and listening to the lectures.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that. And we all look forward to hearing the lectures. But for now, we're just going to get an idea of what your thinking has been in the book and what to expect in those lectures, which will be aired on CBC Ideas the week of November 9th. We've worked together many years, Ron, on a number of topics. And in some of our earliest interactions, it was you and your staff who actually introduced me to something called email encryption. I'd never used that before in my life. Later through you, we also learned what is being done, what can be done to thwart democracy and human rights and privacy. using supposedly neutral technology. We're now in 2020, and the dangers of the existing ecosystem, the communications ecosystem, have never been clearer. If your message is not for us to unplug entirely, what precisely is the message that you're trying to convey with your book?
Well, that's a good question. I had several aims in writing this book. I've been swimming in this ocean of digital technology for over 30 years, and I've seen it evolve through many different iterations and flavors, and now with social media all around us. But as never before, it feels to me like there is a kind of gestalt in the air, that people are sensing that something's not wrong, something's wrong, and they're not quite sure what the cause of it is or what the roots of it are. And so I wanted to kind of bring together all of the research that's been done out there and what I see as a kind of emerging conventional wisdom about the pathologies of social media. Before you can fix something, you need to know what's wrong with it. And so a good portion of the book is going through and dissecting what I call these painful truths about social media. Truths, because as I said, there's a kind of emerging conventional wisdom, consensus, that this is the problem, but painful because frankly, they're very difficult to address and fix. The second aim of the book was to go beyond that. As I've read many others who work in this area, I've been kind of frustrated that, I would hear a long itemization of all of the problems around social media and digital technologies, and then maybe a few summary recommendations at the very end. And meanwhile, I've thought long and hard about where we need to go, or at least how to think about how we approach solving some of these complicated problems. So I really wanted to go beyond just listing out all that's wrong and kind of point us towards a path where we could take some steps to fix some of these problems.
So let's take each of these areas in turn. Let's talk about the first mission a little bit, the painful truths that you talk about. You remind us repeatedly throughout the book that when the environment changes, when technological environments change, it can take human history in very unexpected directions. And obviously we've seen that happen and we've read about it happening, over the years. But I want to ask you this, is it truly an unintended consequence when our devices and our social media have become a major source of insecurity that's exploited not just by governments, but also by autocrats and bad actors?
Yeah, I think so. I think obviously not all of it is unintended. There are some things, some features of surveillance capitalism that are definitely by design. I mean, the intent of the platforms is to drill deeper and deeper into our everyday lives, to see our habits, our social relationships, the information that we send and receive as their data. So we're effectively something that they have appropriated as their property. That's very much by design. That's not an unintended consequence. But what is unintended, I think, are all of the surrounding contextual factors. So for example, much of the communications ecosystem that we rely on is highly insecure. Security has largely been an afterthought, or much of the insecurities of the internet are externalized, they're passed on to users, or patched backwards haphazardly. So if you recall, early in the internet's evolution, many people assumed that dictators and autocrats would be unable to withstand and continue their forms of rule with this, light speed communications and distributed communications going on all the time. But in fact, what they've been able to do is exploit the fact that their adversaries have within their pockets, beside them on their bedside tables, devices that are designed to infiltrate their lives, but are insecure, allowing those autocrats and dictators and others to essentially peer inside their lives. That was not a design feature. That was an unintended consequence of our reliance and effectively our submission to this always-on interconnected world that we've kind of sleepwalked into.
The insecurity is a major feature. I wonder if we could speak about the complicity that we have in all of this. You say this repeatedly again in the book, that in today's communications ecosystem, we are complicit in our own exploitation. How unprecedented is that, and what are the implications?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually think it's, it's funny. People often come up to me and ask me, should I download this app? Is it safe to use this? If I'm using Facebook, should I, maybe do some privacy settings or whatever?
Is the phone listening?
Is the phone listening? That's another one I get all the time. And I, kind of scratch my head and kind of think about how can I properly answer this? Because to really answer it, you have to get into the weeds and dig deep into the entire environment, the technological infrastructure and the economy that surrounds it to properly answer that question. And it has begun to dawn on me that there's a kind of unfair onus put on users, on consumers, to navigate all of this. I mean, if you look at the act of consent, for example, which most of us are familiar with because we have dozens of apps on our phones, and every time we go to install an application, especially now with COVID and work from home routines, we're swiping through these consent banners and effectively trivializing the act of consent. No one, unless you're a lawyer, is able to understand, let alone have the time to read through all of these thousands of pages of legal disclaimers when you download one of these apps. And in fact, that's also by design. The companies want us to kind of, slip into this world comfortably, not get too concerned about what happens beneath the surface, and consent to having them essentially appropriate our data as their property. So it's kind of like with climate change. There's some things that users can do, and yes, we all have to take some personal responsibility for what we do and the actions, the choices we make online. But ultimately, this is a systemic problem, and it's only going to be solved through systemic responses. It's unfair to put the onus on individuals in the context of this larger environment that is like a tectonic force. It surrounds them. And that's why it's so daunting to contemplate, I think, for many people. What am I supposed to do? I mean, I can't keep up. It's just one thing after another, overwhelmed with privacy scandals and data breaches and surveillance technology. Now with COVID, it's all amplifying. I don't blame people for frankly being a bit flummoxed and confused and feeling kind of desperate about it all.
In the midst of all that confusion, I think it's probably fair to say, and you point this out again in your book and other writing, that we all know what social media is doing to our brain. We all know what it's done to the larger conversation. We all know what it's done to our privacy. We all know that it may, in fact, have led to acts of genocide, as Greg mentioned earlier, that we have become the product, or to use your words, that we're raw materials, something akin to unwitting livestock for their massive data farms. What perhaps we may not know as well, Ron, is that today's technology, as you say, has a profound effect on how we organize ourselves, our physical selves, but also our political selves. You actually go as far as saying that the implications, that liberal democracy is on the line as a result. Mm-hmm. How is that? Can you develop that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the way in which this technological transformation that we've gone through and that I've kind of witnessed throughout my professional career, it has happened really in a short period of time. Within the time frame of really a single generation are the most intense of these changes, especially with respect to social media. We're talking like within a decade or 15 years, the way in which we communicate and seek and receive information has totally transformed. And that's a huge change in the material context of the world in which we live. Now, when it comes to liberal democracy, I think it's important to remind ourselves that historically speaking, liberal democracies are very rare. They're actually quite fragile. And we kind of, living in Canada or living in Europe or the United States, many people might see them as permanent fixtures. Well, this is the way it's always been throughout my life. We have elections, we have human rights protections, we have the rule of law, we have oversight mechanisms and so on. But historically speaking, they're fragile and rare. And when the material context changes in such a rapid fashion, and put strains on many of those pillars that we have taken for granted as kind of natural features, when in fact they're simply social constructs, it's quite possible that we could lose this form of rule, this type of politics that we've relied on. And you can see evidence of it everywhere, from disinformation raining down constantly, from the toxic discourse on public sphere and social media in general, this debasement of our conversations, the polarization that people can see in front of them on their eyes, the descent into authoritarianism. The world seems to be ruled by a kind of transnational class of gangsters, of kleptocrats. Now, this isn't all because of changes in communication technologies. As I say in the book, the way to think about it is as if this is a change in the environment. And when you have a sudden change in the environment, some species flourish and thrive, and others wither and die out. And we have to remind ourselves that the Constitution, if you will, in a small c sense, of liberal democracy is a human construct. It needs to be tended to, and it can very easily dissolve and wither away.
Mm-hmm. There's a very specific point and a major theme in your book where you talk about what you began your answer with, this kind of great leap forward in technology where, it's created a situation where we have, I think you put it, 21st century superpower policing governed by 20th century safeguards. What are the implications there for individuals and, privacy, for example?
Right. Well, policing, law enforcement, intelligence practices, obviously very important component of the state, very important when you're thinking about civil liberties and some of the other human rights that are core to liberal democracy. The way I would encourage people to think about this is, I notice there's a kind of habit some people have to think about authoritarian practices as something that just happened over there somewhere. And we can, divide the world into authoritarian regimes here and liberal democratic countries over there. But that's not the case at all. In fact, authoritarian practices, which are basically about undermining public accountability, sowing division and chaos, are universal. They cut across political boundaries. And of course, when it comes to law enforcement, the sharp end of the stick of the state, the agencies that can arrest people and in some jurisdictions actually end their lives, the technologies that these agencies have at their disposal now have profoundly exploded in terms of sophistication and capability and the ability to peer inside people's lives in the most intimate ways. If you think about facial recognition technologies combined with artificial intelligence, for example, this has provided law enforcement with extraordinary means to do the jobs that they do. Now, the problem is there are many countries in the world, many state agencies around the globe that lack accountability, that don't have proper oversight, that are home to systemic prejudices, biases, racism, as we're seeing in the United States and Canada. And so the introduction of these very powerful technologies is amplifying all of these pre-existing tendencies. So just to give you one example, in decades past, if someone was a dissident in a country, an authoritarian country, under a dictatorship, and they managed to somehow flee that country to somewhere like Canada, they're more or less safe. I mean, it's possible that the dictator could send somebody abroad, and that certainly happened in the past, track them down, monitor them, kill them, and so on. But today, thanks to the surveillance technologies that I describe in the book, dictators can effectively get inside a dissident's head and monitor everything they're doing, even their most intimate thoughts, in ways that are unprecedented. So this has really amplified the power of despotism in the world today. And that's why we're seeing so many cases, one after another, of this kind of transnational repression becoming a main feature of the global landscape today. It's because of those insecure devices that are always on, connected to everybody, sitting in the confines of their of the safety, so they think of their room, but which are almost insecure by design. And layered on top of it, you have this enormous market of a private industry that whets the appetite and services the needs and wants of autocrats, dictators, and others. And that's just that one side of the world. So we're going through, I believe, when people talk about the impacts of social media and digital technologies, the one that they are not really zeroing in on, that's the most important, is the way it's transforming policing in general and what this means for human rights and civil liberties.
I presume that it's partly the remarkable nature of that kind of reach that leads to the rest of us feeling kind of powerless in the face of such power. I wonder what your thesis is as to, when we know these dangers, we know the effects of social media, we know what it's all doing to us, that social media continues to be popular, in fact grows in popularity. Why do we keep using it?
Well, the hidden secret here is, of course, they're designed to be addictive. It's like anything else that's addictive, that's not good for you, yet people do it, and they kind of realize this is not good for me. And it's part of the reason why you can't blame individual consumers. These products, these things that we all hold in our hands and carry with us around all the time, are designed by neuroscientists, by behavioral psychologists, to make them as unquittable as possible. Little buzzers going off all the time, little red lights flashing, reminders, cues, and so on. This is like B.F. Skinner globalized. And, on a daily basis, these huge tech platforms are undertaking essentially psychological experiments on their customers to try to keep them engaged. That's also why you have this sensational, extreme content constantly being surfaced. It just so happens, human cognitive architecture being what it is, that we're attracted, sadly, to that sort of content. And so, genuinely, I think it's very difficult for people to pull themselves away from it. Many people say, oh, well, you should just throw your phone away and unplug and so on. It's difficult to do that because they're so compelling to use, but also because the incentive structures are so strong. It's very difficult to detach yourself when the rest of the world is connected to these platforms and to these devices.
Just as an aside, I mean, it's always interesting to know that Ron Deibert himself is on social media. I mean, you were tweeting up a storm today about what was going on tonight, and you're on Instagram, and, it's not every day that an author says they're having their book reviewed or read for review by Edward Snowden. How do you guys communicate?
Well, I had the privilege of being asked to help out with some of the Snowden disclosures by journalists here in Canada, and got to know Ed indirectly in that manner. Myself and some members of my team analyzed some of those early Canadian-related Snowden disclosures, and then, through the community of which we're both a part, on separate panels and so on, we've had the fortune of being able to meet and talk to each other on several occasions. As to how we communicate directly, well, maybe we should just put that aside for now.
I thought you might say that. Turning now to your second and arguably even more important mission in this book, which is, going beyond the describing what is wrong and starting to look at, how to fix it all. You, of course, have taken a very proactive role in doing that, beyond what most of us would be able to do with Citizen Lab. You say that the lab's mission is to serve as, quote, counterintelligence for global civil society. So, in effect, it is watching the watchers. So, in essence, it's a public service. And yet there have been some pretty major costs associated with serving in that role. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. When I think about that phrase, I actually coined it when I was putting together the original proposal for the Citizen Lab back in 2001. And it was kind of ridiculous back then. It was, all sorts of hubris. We had no basis to claim we were counterintelligence for anyone, let alone global civil society as a whole. But thankfully, over time, as very talented personnel were drawn into the lab, case studies accumulated, and the techniques and methods became more refined, we actually found ourselves, kind of approaching that category in terms of the mission of the lab and the service that we provide, if you will, through the public reporting that we do. And this is about lifting the lid on the internet, is the way I think about it, to uncover abuse of power. However, when you are successful at something like that, obviously the people that you're poking into are not just going to sit back and let it happen. There's that old saying, careful what you wish for, right? Mm-hmm. So I was hoping, aspiring that we would serve this role, and lo and behold, now we do. We've had all sorts of things come back at us, some that you'd expect. We've been sued, threatened with lawsuits by the big companies that we expose, their bad practices. That's fairly routine for people who do that type of accountability work. But because we work in highly sensitive areas, we're peering into effectively, signals intelligence, into the clandestine work of some of the world's most notorious dictators, and what they're doing. They obviously don't like that. So we've been subjected to hacks, people trying to penetrate our own systems, try to defend ourselves as best as we can about that. Probably the most frightening in recent times was the whole Black Cube episode, where we organized this counter sting. My colleague John Scott Railton at Citizen Lab, just a wonderful, talented person, a dogged researcher and investigator in his own right, was able to kind of turn the tables on what was an attempt to effectively infiltrate the lab through clandestine means, record us to try to incriminate us in some manner. And, along with colleagues at Associated Press, we organized this counter sting, as I said.
Well, I want to slow you down there, because it's actually quite a story. Could you kind of just go back and explain how you set up this sting?
Well, one of our staff, Bahar Abdul Razak, who's an enormously talented researcher and a Syrian immigrant to Canada, someone reached out to him with a seemingly benign proposal to meet him and talk about support for Syrian refugees. And Bahar met with this person, but found the meeting very strange because the person kept, shoving his face closer and closer on the table as if he was recording him at a very swank downtown Toronto hotel. So he wisely, very sagely, came back to the Citizen Lab and said, I just had this meeting and it's very strange. And we were all together at the time, started, peeling back the layers and the digital artifacts, the business card, the website that we could find related to this person and their alleged company. It was a false identity that they were putting forward. We immediately surmised this. And about 2 weeks later, they made the terrible mistake of trying to do the same thing with John Scott Railton. And I've often said, if there's one person in the Citizen Lab you would not want to choose to do this to, it would be him, because he is our most talented, among the most talented open source intelligence researchers, and he let the ruse play out. He recorded hours of conversations with this person who went under the pseudonym Michael Lambert, to try to gather incriminating information about the Citizen Lab, why we do the research that we do, and so on. Eventually, they met in a restaurant in Manhattan. We invited Associated Press camera people to accompany us. They were recording the whole thing. John had his suit outfitted with cameras and microphones of his own. So it was like a spy versus spy affair. And at a certain point, we just dropped the whole pretense and exposed this person's, blew their cover. Turned out to be a person working for this company, Black Cube, which is made up of veterans of Israel's Mossad spy agency. That is very serious stuff. Like that, when something like that happens to you, it's interesting. As I say in the book, we felt a little, I wouldn't say exactly, a little like the people that we study who are targeted in this manner on a daily basis. And you begin to realize the fear that this insinuating fear that kind of seeps into your lives. You're constantly looking over your shoulder, thinking twice. I mean, people joke about it, but it's very, very unpleasant to be in the crosshairs. And as I said, that's our experience, relatively minor compared to what people whom we study experience on a daily basis around the world.
And what kind of reaction do you get from government or from law enforcement agencies in Canada to that kind of experience here in Canada?
Well, there was silence. That was one. There was no official condemnation of it, which I thought would have been appropriate, or at least a criminal investigation of this. We have a funny relationship because we are positioned quite explicitly as a watchdog of governments. We are using some of the same methods and techniques, although very much within legal, ethical bounds, to turn the tables, to watch the watchers. Obviously, no government is going to necessarily welcome that, especially the ones that operate in the shadows. I know within Canada, I have many friends and colleagues who work for the government who appreciate and applaud what we do. Usually they're in the human rights divisions of foreign affairs ministries. But then there are those who definitely don't like what we do because we're kind of poking at their little secret world that they're very comfortable in. And they wish that groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Bellingcat, Citizen Lab, were not, pulling back the curtains and showing what's happening behind the scenes, because it really benefits them when that doesn't happen. And as I said, they're not going to just sit back and do nothing. They're going to try to neutralize in whatever way they can that sort of activity.
Given your experience and those kinds of examples of experiences, I wonder what your prognosis is for that pushback that you're talking about against not just the insidious effects of technology, but the governments and the bad actors who would abuse it.
Well, I mean, like most people today, I feel pretty deflated about what's going on in the world, generally speaking. I mean, it's rough right now. It feels like everything's kind of falling apart, right? And you on a daily basis, this is even before COVID, before the pandemic, we all felt kind of that way, and seems to be getting worse. But, I obviously wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't carry hope for change. We have a theory of change at the Citizen Lab. What we do is meant to accelerate these conversations, raise awareness, spur people on to take steps to mitigate some of the harms and negative externalities that I identify in the book. And that's why I was so honored to have this opportunity, because I know this is the type of forum, writing a book of this sort. It's not an academic book. It's meant to inspire people, who I consider my peers, who, very smart people who are concerned, but aren't necessarily academics or specialists in this area. And I feel I have some ideas, modestly speaking, that I think we could apply. None of it's fancy. There's no super cyber theory here. No application, certainly, that's going to solve these problems. Just some basic old-fashioned political ideas about restraint mechanisms that we need to kind of reinvest time in. And that includes doing the type of work that you do as an investigative journalist. Sadly, investigative journalism has eroded, lack of funding, sources for that sort of thing. Investigative journalism, critical public service and a constraint on the abuse of power in its own right. And yet all across the world, we're seeing newsrooms basically emptied out, opportunities lost, and journalists beaten, harassed, arrested, and murdered. This is bad news. We need to make sure that doesn't happen if we care about liberal democracy. And the same applies for all the other restraint mechanisms that I outline in the book.
But maybe sketch out a little bit of what that restraint looks like. I mean, you wanted this book to kind of help fill the gap where prescription is concerned. Can you tell us kind of where does that idea of restraint comes from, and what does it look like for the everyday average day that we live in this environment?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have to think about them in two different senses: how we think about restraining what governments do, and how we think about restraining what big companies do. And, thankfully, as I said, I didn't have to invent anything new here. I just went back through the history of liberal Republican thought and practice all the way back to ancient Greece. People have thought about these ideas. They've thought about abuse of power, checks and balances, separation of powers, all of these basic principles that are, we kind of take them for granted in a way. They're so common that we kind of pay lip service to them, but we don't actually invest in them and understand what they mean to the extent that we need to. So having mechanisms strengthened around oversight and, privacy commissioners with real teeth and so on, that's very important in order to recover the constraints around the abuse of power when it comes to what governments are doing. With big companies, I'm very glad to see now there are conversations emerging about antitrust. And we forget that antitrust originally, when the ideas were first formed, was as much a political concept as an economic concept. The basic idea, which is at the heart of the small r Republican thinking, is big is bad. Concentration of power is bad. It's not bad necessarily for the efficiency of a company like Amazon to be so huge and to own all of the stuff that they do. No, Jeff Bezos is swimming in money now, as we've all seen. Richest man in the world, his wealth went up by 50 billion in the course of the pandemic. It's grotesque to see that inequality of wealth. So we need to look into breaking those companies up and exercising public authority. Let's not leave it to the platforms to decide what to do. That's something that the public authority is designed to cover. Of course, we don't want to go too far in the opposite direction. There's kind of a sweet spot here because there are many governments around the world that are using the excuse of regulating social media or even the pandemic, as we're seeing, to further their authoritarian aims. So we have to be very careful about how to apply this and apply it prudently and pragmatically, but recalling that, division of power is an essential element of liberal Republican thinking and practice.
There is a division of power, but there's also just the nature of the technology itself. How do you put the genie back in the bottle when the entire ecosystem is based, as you say, on surveillance capitalism and making money from the intimate information of the average human being?
Well, I don't think we want to put the genie back in the bottle entirely. I think that there are many aspects of social media that we want to certainly, soften is not the right word, but control, mitigate the harms, understand some of the negative externalities, but we don't want to turn the whole thing off. I think, this is a very important point to underline that, there are many aspects of digital technologies that are not only positive, I would go so far to say they're essential to the survival of the human species. We will need something like the internet to govern our globe, right? We live on a shared planet. We're not going backwards. There's only one way forward. And it's clear that we have these existential challenges that we face. So we need satellites to monitor the planet. We need to be able to have a forum where we can engage and deliberate. It's just that the current constitution of it around surveillance capitalism is dysfunctional to those aims. So we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to apply some very intelligent restraints around how it's organized.
Last thing, and you hinted at this at the very beginning of our conversation, the Massey lectures have been airing since the early 1960s, certainly on CBC Ideas, and you were looking down that list of names of people who preceded you. Just what it means to you to be this year's Massey lecturer, Ron.
I'll probably start tearing up if I answer that question honestly, because those listening to Lister Sinclair all the way through to you, having those broadcasts be so central to the formation of what I consider to be my own intellectual outlook. And then there's the books. I mean, the books to me are foundational. I mean, I was trained as a political scientist, political philosophy as undergrad. That's where I went. And you can't take a degree in political philosophy without going through those epic books, those foundational books. And so it's just central to my own formation as an intellectual. And as I said, just completely surreal to find myself here I am delivering one of those lectures. So I hope I don't disappoint any of those people on the list, or anyone else for that matter who may read the book.
I'm sure not. We're honored to have you, and thank you for the conversation, and we look forward to more and to your lectures, which again will be airing the week of November 9th, starting at 8 p.m. every night on CBC Ideas. Thank you, and back to you, Nathalie.
Thank you, Nahlah.
Well, what a wonderful conversation. It gives us a little bit of a glimpse of what to expect in the Ideas program. We are looking forward to listening to you more, Ron Deibert. And I think we all want to say congratulations tonight, and what an honor it is, and what a responsibility is to all of us to confront the world we live in. And that's what Ideas, and that's the House of Anansi Press, and what the Massey Lecture is all about. It's our duty and our responsibility to become good citizens and understand what's going on around us. So I want to thank, obviously, the team at Massey College, Matt Glanfield and Aberisi, for helping us put this together. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much to all the participants, to House of Anansi Press and Bruce, Greg Kelly at the Ideas and CBC, and Ron Deibert and Nahlah. Thank you so much. What a wonderful evening it was to spend a little bit of time with you. Merci. Thank you.